Gerald, start over, comrade. You got to unmute.
Welcome to Frontline Dispatches on Organizing Upgrade, a show dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent left and organizing activism happening around the country and beyond for racial and economic justice and much more. And tune in for future episodes of Frontline Dispatches every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Pacific time. My name is Gerald Lenoir, and I will be a co-host today along with Max Elbaum, an editor of Organizing Upgrade. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please leave your comments and chats, and we'll be monitoring those as the show goes on. And if you haven't yet, give Organizing Upgrade a like and subscribe to this channel. And finally, to stay up to speed with all the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. Okay, let's do it. Our guest today is Bill Fletcher. Bill is the executive director of globalafricanworker.com. And he's recently written an article for Organizing Upgrade called Post-Election Reckoning, New Hypotheses for the Road Ahead. And we'll be talking to him today about that article. Welcome, Bill.
Oh, sorry. No, I was muted, apparently. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be on, and you owe me a cappuccino for this.
Definitely, I owe you more than a cappuccino. But Max is also with us, and we're just want to talk about your article, Bill. If you could just summarize in a few words what the article is about and what your conclusions are about the road ahead.
Sure. This was an article that I co-authored with Carl Davidson, and basically we were talking immediately after the election. It was our preliminary analysis. And the features that I want to emphasize are that this is an election about race, revanchism, and a rejection of reality. That it was an election about voter suppression. It was an election taking place in the middle of a plague. And I think that in terms of the first 3 points, the issue of race cannot be overstated when we're talking about this election in terms of who turned out, in terms of the message of Trump, in terms of the responses to the George Floyd murder, which resulted in protests around the country, as everyone knows, and a very significant mobilization of the African-American electorate and the young electorate. But it also, race played out in the mobilization of the right wing. And in that sense, Trump channeled Richard Nixon, who in 1968 used the protests, the disturbances, the rebellions as a way of arguing that law and order and, in fact, repression needed to be instituted. And Trump was successful in mobilizing a significant number of people there. Revanchism is a term most familiar, most associated with Germany after World War I and World War II. And it's a certain kind of politics that is about revenge, but revenge at the level of people that argue that something has been taken from them that they want back. So revanchism in the US context with the right-wing populist movement includes race, whereby the right wing argues that it doesn't pay to be white anymore. Gender, where the right wing argues that there needs to be a return to the 1950s, the years of June Cleaver and Donna Reed, and those are the codes associated with the gender roles. Revanchism is also in the realm of international politics and the kind of perverse sort of isolationism of Trump and the right wing that basically says the US should not be encumbered by international agreements, but should do whatever the hell it wants. And finally, the rejection of reality millions of people were willing to go along with the idea that there's no pandemic, that it's just simply a bad flu. They were willing to go along with the idea that there's no environmental catastrophe, and that this is just, things happen. And even if they personally don't believe it, they thought it was so insignificant that they would vote for this clown. I guess the other part of the article that we were trying to get at, or one of the other significant pieces, was that in this kind of moment, it's not sufficient to just talk about movement building as a response to the continued rise of a right-wing populist insurgency, that we need organization, that that movements arise for a whole set of reasons. Organizations can help to build them, but more often than not, organizations emerge and help to influence them. And that what we need desperately is organization, building left organization in particular, in response to this right-wing onslaught, as well as a way of putting pressure on centrist Democrats who, without pressure, are going to retreat. There's other things I could say, but I'm going to stop there.
Well, Bill, I thought one of the provocative things in your piece was in response to what you just said about the right-wing populism and revanchism. You talked about a mass campaign for one person, one vote as one of the key steps we might take going forward. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and how you see that out in terms of the fight against right-wing populism and racism?
Well, I appreciate that, Max. So part of this is historical in the sense that the U.S. has a very strange political system on multiple levels. So that whereas most other countries have one person, one vote, whoever gets the most votes wins the election, the presidential election is navigated through the Electoral College, a system that was created in order to reinforce a particular level of power for southern states and for smaller states. So that we have situations like we had in Florida in 2000 or in the 2016 election where the person who has the popular vote doesn't necessarily win. So a very basic democratic demand is one person, one vote. And this whole notion of having electoral college presents this problem that we see time and again with so-called battleground states, whereby the elections come down to what happens in a few key states, which in effect means that the votes of other people are almost irrelevant. And one example that really hit me, Max, was after the 2012 election. I was talking to a friend in South Carolina who pointed out to me that the Obama campaign had put no resources into South Carolina, yet Obama got 40% of the vote. But because he didn't get the majority vote, those 40%, that didn't count. And this is absurd. So part of what I'm saying is that as part of the fight against the various efforts at voter suppression, we need to get rid of the Electoral College and institute one person, one vote. And that needs to be central to our demand to democratize the system. One final point, Max, is that you may have noticed, and other people may have noticed, that there's segments of the right that over time have really called into question whether everybody should be able to vote. And in the circumstances around the 2020 election, there were people on the right that started to articulate this message. The US is not a democracy, it's a republic. And this was interesting because, growing up, whether I believed it was a democracy or not, I mean, what we were always told in school is that this was a democracy. But what's interesting is that the right is trying to reframe it to once again make the argument that not everybody should vote and that it is okay to have more and more restrictions, which we've increasingly seen since the 2008 election.
And what do you think? What do you make of the divisions that have opened up between at least a small layer of Republicans, like the Georgia Secretary of State, who are defending the outcome of the election, versus the QAnon and Trump and those forces that are saying the whole thing was rigged, there was massive fraud? What prospects do you think that offers for us, or what do you make of it?
Well, that's what I've been trying to figure out. My initial conclusions are these: that the Republican Party has consolidated as a hard right-wing party. From the period of roughly 1970 through the Obama years, what we have seen is forces that were originally called the New Right successfully driving out of the Republican Party forces that would have been described at one point as liberal. The Rockefeller Republicans, the Jacob Javits, Colin Powell, who is a Republican. There's no place for this element within the Republican Party as it has moved further and further to the right. And that part of the moving to the right has been an active alliance between elements of the Republican establishment and a right-wing populist movement at the base. What has in effect happened is much like the story of Dr. Frankenstein and the monster. Dr. Frankenstein created a monster which it thought it could control. The monster had other ideas. The Republican establishment thought that it could control this right-wing populist movement. That movement has other ideas and has in effect turned on much of the Republican establishment in one way or another. Now, that means that the elements in the Republican Party have to basically decide, is there in fact a place for them anymore? And at this moment, the answer seems to be a qualified yes, that they think that they'll stick with the Republican Party, even though there were elements like the Lincoln Project that broke off, and you have the battle that's going on right now with Georgia's governor. I think that there's a possibility, though, Max, that what could happen is a slow peeling off of Republicans who then come into the Democratic Party and try to shift the Democratic Party further to the right. But I'm not expecting a mass split. I had wondered in 2016 whether we were going to see this splintering. But what was fascinating was that even though the Republican establishment and all of the candidates despised Trump, at the end of the day, they were ready to close ranks, in part because they looked at Trump as a blunt force object to advance their overall agenda. So even though they may personally despise him and not trust him, they saw him as useful in moving things like the tax changes of 2017, the court appointments, et cetera.
Well, I want to return to the comment that you made about abolishing the Electoral College. I'm sure you'll agree that's a tall order. What do you see as a strategy for moving towards that, for the movement to incorporate that into the movement for the democratization and voting rights?
Well, some states, Gerald, have taken some steps already whereby the votes that are received are allocated proportionally. And so you don't have the situation in South Carolina of the entire state going to a Republican in that case, but that it is divided up, which undermines the original purpose of the Electoral College, which is great. Another thing is runoff voting, and whereby people can indicate order of preference. So you have a number of reforms that are currently being instituted, and I believe that that's what we have to do. We have to spread that around the country and move these changes, because what we have to make the argument to the regular people is that if you're not in a swing state, your vote doesn't really count if you're in the minority. I was talking to someone a labor leader in New York, who was telling me that Trump received about 42% of the vote. Now, most of us think New York is a blue state. Well, it is in terms of the majority of the electorate, But 42%, that's a significant amount of people that voted for Trump. Their votes didn't count for anything at the presidential level. So even though I'm far from defending conservatives, at the level of genuine democracy, everyone's vote should count.
Bill, I want to come back to the point in your article about the interrelationship between street heat and movement building and organization and strategy. I've been in a number of discussions coming off your article since it was published, and that's one of the issues that comes up all the time. People are not quite clear on that. Are you devaluing the importance of movement building? Where does that fit in? Those kinds of questions come up. So if you could expand a little bit on that, I think that'd be very helpful.
Well, thanks again. That has been controversial, and I'm glad that it has, because we wanted to shake people up, to be blunt, Max. What we were trying to get at is that the left is ambivalent about electoral politics. Every 4 years after vomiting, we'll vote. Many of us miss the midterm elections. We focus on the presidential elections, but don't think enough about the down ballot elections. Now, over the last 10 years, there's been an increasing number of folks on the left that have been paying greater attention to electoral politics. In your state, people like Anthony Thigpen and the California Calls effort, the New Virginia Majority, the changes that have gone on in the Working Families Party, and other places where very rooted activists on the left have been engaging on inside and outside of the Democratic Party work. And I think that needs to be applauded. But fundamentally, what we're getting at, Max, is that we need to be involved in a fight for power. It's not enough to protest. And one of the problems in the left is that you have people, including some who have theorized this, that wish to stay away from the fight for power. They basically want us to be in the streets influencing the elites, as opposed to fighting for power. Because see, you fight for power, it gets messy, very messy. You engage in all kinds of coalitions with people you don't necessarily like. It gets very complicated. A lot of people on the left, they'd rather forego the complications and just figure, let's throw stones and force the elite to do things. So what we're saying is, no, we've got to be engaged in a fight for power, because this is really what it's about, both in the short term and the longer term. The fight over court appointments, the fight over jobs and economic development, the fight over immigration policy. All of these things are central to what we should be doing. And it's what is called the fight for governing power. So what we're arguing is that is what we need to be focused on. To put it in another way, Max, a few years ago, I was in Texas, and I was giving a speech to a left group, and they were talking about how bad the situation was in Texas. And it's like, oh my God, the right is doing this, the right is doing that. I listened to them, and then I finally said, okay, I hear you. So here's my question. How do we take over Texas? And they got silent. And they looked at me as if I had lost my mind. And I said, no, seriously, how do we take over Texas? If we're not talking about how do we take over Texas and how do we win progressive power in Texas, what the hell are we doing? Let's just pass out some joints and call it a day. I said, let's talk about what are the key cities that need to be won? What are the counties? What are the counties that we can afford to lose? What are the key social movements in Texas? Who are the key opinion makers? Let's do a battle map of Texas and figure out what are the steps in order to win. A few weeks ago, I had a discussion with some activists in Florida, great activists, younger activists. And they ultimately asked me the same question, Bill, what do you think we should do? I said, how do we take over Florida? Right? I said, I realize Florida is really 4 states, but let's just say it's geographically called Florida. Let's figure out what we need to do. And that's, Max, what we were trying to get at the article. Let's talk about what are the steps needed to fight for power. It doesn't mean giving up street heat. I mean, that's a travesty, obviously. And we're going to need to do a lot of that, particularly with the Biden administration. We're going to have to be on them like white on rice and pushing them hard. And that's going to be at the ballot box and in the streets. But what the left needs to understand is what the right understood in the late 60s and 70s, which is a multi-dimensional fight for power. The right was clear. Mass movements, litigation, political and legislative work. They did not rely on one or the other, but they understood that all of those needed to go on together. We on the left, we're just so ambivalent about electoral work. We'd rather just goes away and let's just stay in the streets. The problem is it doesn't work that way in reality.
So let me just follow up with that. What you're laying out is an integrated strategy that incorporates street heat, legislative work, inside, outside, electoral work. Coming out of this last election, do you see a change on the left? There's a lot of groups that have started to talk about power building at the state level. And I think that some groups that ignored electoral politics have jumped in, and some of the groups that only played the inside game seem to be a little more sympathetic to street action than they were before Trump. What's your take on the prospects for the period ahead?
I agree with your assessment, but let me tell you my worry. We on the left despair very easily. And what often happens is, and that's what I worry about now. You elect a centrist, a liberal, as president, and he doesn't do exactly what we want. And people say, I told you. It's all a waste, right? That's what I worry about. And I think what we have to say is, no, this is a long road. That we need to be thinking about the midterm elections right now. We need to be thinking about local office. We need to be thinking about building base areas. We need to be thinking about ballot initiatives. We need to be thinking in a very comprehensive way. And so, yes, right now, there are folks that have come out of the woodwork that have engaged in electoral work who opposed voting for Democrats, but not, no, I understand it's different. And that's good. I'm hoping that they don't retreat. But part of stopping people, or how can I put it? Part of addressing this ambivalence in a peculiar way comes back to understanding the nature of the moment, understanding race, and understanding right-wing populism. That one of the mistakes on the left, up until maybe September, was that a lot of the left thought this was a race between Biden and Trump. And they didn't understand this was not a race between Biden and Trump. This was a race between forces that were in favor of democracy and a right-wing populist movement. And all of a sudden around September 1st, people started to realize, oh, okay, I got it. This is a different election. And that right-wing populist movement has not gone away. So not only do we have a struggle to push the centrist Democrats, the Biden-Harris administration and their allies, but we have a mission to destroy the right-wing populist movement. It must be neutralized because the ouster of Trump is simply the ouster of an individual. This movement is clearly not going away, and Trump may not be going away. And they may come back with a vengeance.
Bill Fletcher, that's all we have time for today. Bill Fletcher is the executive editor of globalafricanworker.com. We appreciate your insights and analysis, Bill. You can read his article at organizingupgrade.com. To our audience, if you enjoyed this video, stay up to speed with us on all the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade. You can sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. Thanks, Max Elbaum, for being a co-host, and thank you all who joined us today, and thank for the production team at Organizing Upgrade. Please join us next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Pacific. Take care.
Thank you very much.